Hi, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Please notice that there are read-only items, and we'll go ahead and turn it over to Mike Long.
Hello, everybody. So we're going to do this AMA style, so I'm not sitting here presenting to you. Let me look at the agenda for some first questions here.
Yeah, I had
Corey, do you want to vocalize?
Yeah, so my question, let me try and figure out how to say it. So iterations is a 2-week block, is my understanding. That's defined at the group level for how GitLab itself is using iterations. So how is an actual, where is an actual iteration defined? Not the 2-week block, but what will be accomplished in the 2 weeks? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think if I understand the question, the iterations started around July. An engineering manager from Plan created the first iteration in the iterations feature, and they've just been incrementing +1 since then. The iterations start and end should be, when you click into the iteration or even on the iteration list, it should say the start and end date for the iteration. But I'm guessing I don't understand your question totally.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, so say you have an issue. Is the issue scoped to the 2-week iteration? Is it like the scope of the issue supposed to be what you are going to accomplish in that 2 weeks? Or is the issue scoped to whatever the problem is and you are adding an iteration and then you're changing the iteration over time?
Yeah, it could go either way. I think in a perfect world, an issue is scoped to a 2-week iteration, but it's not necessary because we could, if the issue is still in progress, we could set it to the next iteration, or we could say, we plan to do this 2 or 3 weeks from now. Now that iteration is 1 week away, I'm going to move this issue out 2 more iterations because I still don't think we're going to get to it. Or you could even reprioritize issues and change them to a more immediate or upcoming iteration. So sometimes it'll be scoped to 2 weeks, and I think that's ideal. Or it'll be a larger issue that carries from iteration to iteration as it's in progress.
So for someone who is not the DRI on the issue, how do I come in and know what the scope is and the deadline, if it could be either?
Yeah, if you're not the DRI on the issue and you'd like to know the scope and the deadline, I guess what's the use case you're thinking where you'd look at an issue and want to know the scope and the deadline?
Mostly, I think it would be product managers would be looking at, all right, we have this set of issues. I see it's in this iteration. Does that mean it's going to be complete in 2 weeks? Or does that mean I'm going to keep changing the iteration as I need to because the scope of the issue is larger?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it would be so I think it's difficult to know, I think, if something is in scope and if we're actually going to be able to accomplish it by the iteration that we committed to. It's difficult to do those things if we don't have a regular iteration planning event. Typically, on most Agile teams I've been on, we'll have an iteration kickoff, and we'll also close an iteration with a retrospective. Where we're async and we tend to do those things kind of continuous. I think it would really just depend on the team and what they consider in scope and out of scope, or what they consider too big or just right. But I think if a team can try to commit, or a designer can try to commit to making issues that are a 2-week scope, that over time, you'll start to see the iterations become, or the issues become kind of evenly sized, where you don't have these big complex things and then these little tiny things. We have things that are kind of a happy medium, and we have a more of a continuous flow. So the iteration as a smaller constraint than a milestone is to encourage more work that's like right sized, or just the right size. So they don't go on for a really long time because they're too big in scope. I may have over answered your question, but let me know how it's going. Are we closer to answering it?
So what I think I've heard is there might be an issue that solves a problem that takes longer than 2 weeks, but then there are iterations that more clearly define the steps that you take to get to the solution in that overall issue. And so I'm wondering, Mike, do you have an example of how you have seen iterations used to effectively break down that larger issue into smaller pieces, and maybe be specific about, and so this is the first thing they did in the iteration, and that this was the second thing?
Mm-hmm. I think the closest thing that we have is if you go to slide 8 and click into iteration 9, there's a link at the bottom of slide 8 that opens iteration 9. And if you scroll through that, you'll see examples where there's validation issues that designers have created and closed. In terms of like an example of like, here was the larger issue, and then here's how it broke down, and like actually visualizing that and showing, and then this went into this iteration, that went into the other iteration. I don't have like a series of slides or like a diagram that shows that. But I think if you dig into that example in iteration 9 and look at the validation issues, like there's some created by Austin, Alexis, Holly, and others, you'll get a sense for what a smaller validation issue looks like. And smaller meaning it can fit into a 2-week iteration.
Hi. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I have an example from the plan group. I'm going to share it here in the chat and also add it to the agenda. So the plan team, the then called portfolio management team, used iterative approach, and they call it iterations for epic swim lanes. And they did that like to answer the question that somebody asked previously, what problem this is solving, is that like an iteration doesn't always overlap. Like it's not always the same time frame as GitLab release, which is a month. And here I believe they were using a week-long, well, no, 2-week-long iterations. So if you scroll down in the epic description, you will see how they scope down the work to kind of try to cut horizontally to deliver things that are still usable, but well, we haven't released it, I guess, to the customers. So it's been still behind the feature flag.
That is a great example. I think the difference here is, or one thing to note is the issue actually has iteration 6 and 7 sort of written out in the issue description. I think to dog food iterations, we would actually like point to the iteration that's the iteration object, right? The one that starts on 9/2/2020. We could point to that, and then when you open that, that would contain some of these issues, like the front end and back end issues. I think this was also created by an engineering manager. So this is the build track issues, and planning those out into iterations, which is another valid use case. But yeah, this is a great example, Marcin. Really appreciate it. Is anyone looking at this example and still scratching their heads?
I am still a little bit, but maybe we can go on to other questions and maybe it'll clear things up for me.
And Mike, I think I'd like to share my example and see if this helps clarify for Tori at all how it's kind of played out for me. I'll share my screen and I can post the issue in the docs in a minute. So as we were progressing through the validation track, we had this big issue that was sitting in workflow design, and it wasn't clear necessarily like how are we moving this forward, because it was just sitting there in workflow design. It was seeing all this activity, but nothing was progressing. So what I did was I promoted it to an epic, because as I was like understanding the scope more, as I was getting more involved with the problem, it was clear there's a lot more work to be done. And so I broke this down into smaller chunks of work that I was going to try and do over 2-week increments. So I went from like lo-fi to taking in feedback to converging on the solution, the typical steps we might take in workflow design. And now what's currently open is an issue to go conduct some user research for solution validation. Now that issue might create another one that'll be followed on in like iteration 13 potentially. But for now, as far as I know, like that's the next step. And so this epic kind of will help represent some of those iterations over time. And so that's how I've been trying to review some of those bigger workflow design issues that kind of sit there for a while. They're not just like, hey, let's just add a quick mock-up here. We're going to be good to go, move this forward. These are some of the more complex ideas that probably represent more of an epic rather than just a simple issue, which I've definitely asked the same question that you've been, Tori. So this is kind of what I've settled on trying to do for the quarter.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, Austin.
Yeah.
Austin, while you're here, do you have an example of dependencies? Because I know we had talked about that as well. I think that's a great byproduct of using iterations. So like the blocking is blocking.
Yeah, I don't think I have one up right now, but there were definitely times where I've marked these as like, hey, this is blocking other issues from moving forward because I need to converge on, like initially this was blocked by this one because it needed to have the solution created before we could go validate something. But that just requires a little bit more foresight and planning. But I don't have one off the top of my head that I could just quickly grab.
Excellent. It looks like some people are starting to see the light. Thank you, Austin.
Austin, the way that you just showed, having used that is exactly what I was expecting to see. To me, that was a beautiful example.
Thank you. I'll add it in the notes so people can go check it out. I'll note that like those ones that I was showing were quite small. Like there's really not a whole lot of data in them. I'm trying to be better about actually updating those sub issues as opposed to just putting all the data in the epic, but opportunity for improvement.
Who's next? Libor?
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Austin. That was very helpful to see some more examples, and just see more examples in general, I think is really helpful. One question I had when I started, I wanted to try to dog food it maybe a couple weeks ago, and I apologize if this has been answered somewhere in the handbook or in the documentation somewhere, but I wasn't sure about the naming of the iterations. Do I create my own named iterations? So I saw on GitLab.com, the project had some iterations that already had like specific custom names, but then going on to the GitLab -org project, there were just iterations that looked like they were just automatically created. So it just had like, GitLab, number 2, number 3, and so on. So I wasn't sure then, and then I tried to create my own iteration. So I wasn't sure, should I be using the ones that I see in that list, in my sidebar panel, or should I be creating my own? And then I realized that a lot of other, designers were already using some issues. So I didn't want to break anything. So I just kind of left it alone. Yeah, I see there's some answers there already that someone posted, but yeah, that was my main question about how does that all work together?
Yeah.
Well, and my question
Jackie,
followed up right after yours though, about, because if we're gonna have to use the one that's already defined, do we have to use, for example, iteration 13 or 14? That doesn't make any sense. If this is a new project for my stage or my group, what happened to the previous 13 iterations? Where could I go see those?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
that was my
that
question.
Jackie made a issue. Jackie and I were talking on the phone yesterday, and we both agreed it was more intuitive if the iterations were named after the date range. And this is actually what Pivotal Tracker does. You don't even have to create the iteration, it's just there and it's named after a date range. Seems the most intuitive. And I think Donald, who was as the first dog fooder, has a little bit of stake in like what it's called. And we want to make sure we don't want to break anyone's workflow who's using it heavily. But I think the date range thing is probably going to be the most intuitive and the most scalable for all the teams under the GitLab group. So thanks for doing that, Jackie.
Donald hasn't changed the names yet, but maybe should I just try it?
Yeah, I think maybe it might seem a little daunting. It might take like 20, 30 minutes to do it. Maybe you and I could just do it.
Yeah, I'll just try it and see if it's a problem, then someone will complain, fix it. So maybe I'll just give it a try and start changing a couple of them.
Yeah, thanks. I think that would be really helpful. I was a little confused by that. You know, if I needed to, if I started a new project, my instinct was to just start with iteration 1 and then just go from there. And then I realized that iteration 1 has been already closed and is already passed. So seeing the due date, just a quick follow-up question on that. When I set an iteration, does it automatically update the due date for that issue of when that iteration's over? Or is that like a separate concept?
So if the due date if the issue has a due date and then you assign it to an iteration, does the due date on the issue update?
Yeah, or if you didn't have a due date set at all and you set an iteration, does the due date update to when that iteration ends?
Where's Holly? I don't know the answer to that. I haven't experimented.
Okay. Yeah, I could play around with that as well. Sorry.
No, it doesn't change your due date.
Okay.
It doesn't set a due date for you.
So it's a separate kind of concept.
Yeah, might
Okay.
be a dog fooding pain.
Okay.
I still, this sounds weird. Anyway, I still have a little bit of confusion in Austin's example that makes sense to me that there was an issue. It was really complicated. He promoted it to an epic, totally following that. I see the little issues that were created and that makes sense too. Some of them are labeled as iterations and one of them isn't. And is this about dog fooding iterations a feature or just iterating in that way, creating an epic, breaking things out into smaller issues?
It's both. Easy answer, right? And so if we're breaking complex problems down into smaller issues, and even if they roll up to epics, the thesis behind this whole endeavor is that if we use the iterations feature, it'll help us think more clearly about the scope of those issues and also be more transparent about our plan for approaching this big hairy problem, because any team member can go into that iteration and see issues juxtaposed next to each other and explore and click in and participate earlier in the validation phases. So like if I'm an engineer and I'm a front-end engineer or a back-end engineer, I might like to see that that Libor is looking at a particular problem and coming up with some particular designs that I can then click into and comment on before it goes into planning breakdown or before the idea solidifies too much. So there's a transparency component that we hopefully get by using the iterations feature when we break our problems down to be smaller. And also, yeah, I want to acknowledge that iteration is a word that means different things in different contexts. So an iteration in this case is a sprint. The iterations feature is actually sprints, but we call it iterations in the product.
It looks like I'm next. So Austin, seeing your example was really, really helpful. So I won't reread all of my question, but a question to anyone who's used the iteration feature, I guess, is how are you managing and maintaining a single source of truth with all of this granular issue creation? And how are you making sure that the right conversations are happening in the right place if an engineering team wants to collaborate or a product team wants to collaborate?
I thought I heard that question was for Austin. Is that right?
I mean, anyone who's really has used the feature so well. I mean,
so I was thinking
Yeah,
Austin could answer it.
Yeah, I can revisit what I was saying earlier. I'm still trying to figure that out too. Initially, I was just trying to boil everything up into like one parent issue, which then became the epic. So I'm trying to keep the low level details in the iteration of a specific issue, and then perhaps like those outcomes or the high points of the decision surface into the parent epic for those issues. So maybe you have all this discussion around the interface within one issue, and then your finalized solution is what ends up making up into the epic. Definitely what I've seen over time is issues that are in the validation track just tend to grow and grow and grow. At least it has for compliance, which then creates this massive issue at the end of the validation track, which makes it really hard for the development team to sift through everything, as opposed to trying to whittle it down to what's like the most important detail at the epic level to really tell the story of what are we trying to do here. Because we know a bunch of little decisions happened along the way, but maybe not everything is so important.
okay. Yeah, I worry that, I don't know, I feel like we're like starting to disconnect how maybe the engineering team works and we work by presupposing how an experience can be broken down and implemented, and maybe doing a little too much assuming up front. In that example on slide 15, it was a huge issue. It's very old also. But we kind of just laid out the experience that we believe is like the next step, right? Which is a lot of changes. But we let the engineers, we kind of guided them in saying like a feasible step 1, a feasible step 2, and a feasible step 3, and put requirements in those steps, and then kind of let them break down for implementation as long as there's meeting those requirements, so we don't have like an incomplete experience. So we let kind of the engineers do the iteration while the design is iterated to a place where it can be broken down into. I might just have a different approach to iteration in general.
I think if that works for your team, Andy, keep on keeping on. No, we're not asking anyone to change their process. Yeah, it's more just dog food iterations feature, and maybe you'll find something new pops up from using it. Maybe not, but also don't break anything just to dog food it if something's working for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll say the way that I see us using iterations is to break our own work down, which to Mike's point is to give more transparency into like, these are all of the steps it takes to get to us handing something off to a development team, because it's not, and you know this better than I do probably, like you don't go from 0 to here, go build this, right? So what are all those little steps that get you to that? And then once you give them that, then they can break that down into how they want to implement that, just like you said, because yeah, I don't know how the development team needs to break down their implementation tasks, and I would never presume to tell them how to do that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in and add, I noted it in the document, but we do have a feedback issue for iterations. And I know Austin and a few other folks have been very active in that. So please do continue to put that feedback in. That's really going to be beneficial for us as we continue to add to this feature. And I actually would love to schedule a couple of quick calls with Austin and Tori and a few other folks that I've made some notes about, just to get a little bit deeper feel for how you're using these features. So just look for those coming up on your calendar soon. And thank you so much to everybody who has been dog fooding this and providing that feedback. It's really, really helpful.
Justin, were you able to vocalize your question?
I can, but I did get the answer. I was just wondering at a higher level what the reasoning was behind creating this as a feature in the product. And I think Holly answered it quite nicely.
Anyone else vocalize the question? We're close on running out of time. Okay, Christy.
Yeah, I'll go pretty quickly because honestly, this is something that everybody can just look at. So